The pounding on my RV door at 6:30 in the morning was not the neighborly, welcome to the neighborhood greeting I'd expected in Willowbrook. It was the kind of pounding that rattles the hinges, the kind that makes you wonder if someone's trying to break in rather than say good morning. I had been here for exactly 3 days, just 3, settled in with my beautifully restored 1975 Airstream Safari, parked perfectly legally in the driveway of my new lakeside cabin office. 3 peaceful days of coffee by the water, quiet mornings, and the faint satisfaction that comes from starting over. But that morning, peace cracked apart the moment Karen Blackwood decided to make her grand entrance. When I slid open the small RV window, there she was. Karen, our infamous HOA president, already in full battle gear, flawless blonde hair catching the first rays of Florida sunlight, a pressed red real estate blazer that looked like it had been ironed while she slept, and an expression so sharp it could cut glass. What unsettled me most wasn't her outfit or even the early hour. It was her eyes. They carried this wide, almost haunted look, like she'd just seen a ghost rolling down Maple Street wrapped in aluminum siding. Open. "This door right now!" she barked, voice echoing with the kind of command only years of micromanaging other people's mailboxes could produce. I sighed, set down my half-brewed cup of coffee, my pride and joy compact kitchen setup humming softly behind me, and opened the door. There stood Karen Blackwood, hands trembling just enough to betray the perfect armor of her outward appearance. Dark circles showed beneath her carefully applied makeup. And before I could even greet her, she jabbed a finger at my Airstream like it had personally ruined her life. "Where did you get this?" she demanded. Her voice cracked on the question, wobbling between anger, fear, and something else I couldn't pin down. It wasn't just fury, it was desperation, raw and strange. I had expected HOA complaints, sure. Maybe a citation about improper structures or warnings about guest parking. Only. But this wasn't that. Karen wasn't railing against me living in an RV. She was fixated on the RV itself. Her stare was so intense it felt like she thought it could reveal the Airstream's secrets. And then, just when I thought she was done, she lowered her voice to nearly a whisper. "Does this RV still smell like cedar?" The question stopped me cold. In 45 years of owning all sorts of vehicles, from junky Hondas to overpriced rentals, I had never once been asked about how one smelled on the inside. The specificity of it landed like a slap across the face. And the strange thing was, she wasn't wrong. My RV did have a faint cedar scent, left behind by the original wood lining still hidden beneath Eddie Miller's careful modern renovations. I tried to cut the tension with humor. "Ma'am, I don't usually sniff my vehicles like some kind of truffle-hunting dog, but since you're asking, yes, there's still a little cedar in there if you know where to look." The moment I said it, something shifted in her face. Desperation flickered into recognition, recognition twisted into grief, and grief hardened into rage. Looking back now, I should have asked more questions right then. I should have seen the storm forming, but my instinct was to pull back, to retreat, to avoid confrontation. The truth was, I hadn't bought this Airstream just because it was a collectible beauty, though it was. I'd bought it because I needed a home that moved. After my divorce 6 months ago, the last thing I wanted was another house filled with heavy memories, stale mortgages, and silence where love used to be. I'd retired early from software engineering, had a bit of freedom in the bank, and I wanted something untethered, something that felt alive, portable, mine. This Airstream, with its polished aluminum and history, gave me that freedom. Karen took a slow step back, but her eyes never left the RV's chrome shell as it glinted in the morning light. "This changes everything," she muttered, more to herself than to me. And then louder, with the kind of certainty that makes your stomach sink, she said, "My father always told me this RV would come home one day. He said it always had a way of finding its way back. Before I could ask what that meant, she spun on her heel and marched off, the sharp click of her designer heels tapping against the concrete like a countdown. I stood frozen in the doorway, watching her retreat into the maze of manicured lawns and matching beige mailboxes. The whole exchange had lasted maybe 5 minutes, but it left me feeling like I had stumbled into a story already in progress. One, where my RV was playing a leading role I didn't sign up for. Karen's look wasn't just annoyance, it was obsession. The Airstream itself was a gem, restored over 8 months by Eddie Miller, a craftsman who treated vintage American vehicles like holy relics. Only 847 of this safari model were ever built, making it a prized piece for collectors. I'd picked it up at a bank auction 5 years earlier, Cascade Federal Credit Union unloading it for pennies on the dollar. Title was clean, paperwork solid. Eddie had transformed it into a gleaming mobile masterpiece worthy of magazine covers. It was supposed to be straightforward, but Karen's words and that strange look in her eyes hinted at a history I knew nothing about. And in my experience, when something has a history you don't know, that history has a nasty way of finding you, whether you're ready for it or not. The next 2 days proved me right. My peaceful lakeside retreat turned into something that looked more like a low-budget spy thriller. Karen was everywhere. If I looked out my RV window, there she was, lingering at the corner, driving past in her pristine white Mercedes, or standing across the street pretending to check her phone while her eyes locked on my Airstream. Twice I caught her parked, for 20 minutes at a time, snapping photos with what was definitely not a casual cell phone camera. She had perfected the art of suburban surveillance, and it was starting to get under my skin. By Thursday, I'd had enough. I wasn't going to sit around while the neighborhood watch morphed into a personal stakeout. If Karen had questions about my Airstream, maybe it was time I asked my own. So I drove 30 minutes south to Eddie Miller's garage. Eddie's shop was where old American machines went to be reborn, and where older men went to remind each other that they don't make 'em like they used to. The moment I stepped inside, the smell of motor oil and metal, polish wrapped around me. "Marcus! Good to see you," Eddie called from under a beat-up 1962 Winnebago, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. "How's the Airstream treating you? Electrical system holding up after the rewire?" I gave a weak laugh and then laid out the situation with Karen. The banging on my door, her strange questions, the cedar comment, the obsession that hadn't let up since. As I spoke, I watched Eddie's expression shift from curiosity to something heavier. Recognition, maybe. Concern, definitely. By the time I finished, he had rolled out from under the Winnebago, wiping his hands slowly on a rag, the kind of deliberate slowness that told me he was carefully choosing what to say next. "That Airstream of yours has a history," he finally said, avoiding my eyes in a way that only made my chest tighten. It actually came through my shop twice. First time was about 6 years back. Belonged to a local family. Nice people, but they hit hard financial trouble. The second time was when you brought it in for the full restoration. He hesitated, then added, "The original owner was a man named Richard Blackwood. Ring any bells?" The name landed like a brick to the head. Blackwood, as in Karen Blackwood, my too interested neighbor. I felt the bottom drop out of my stomach. "Eddie, please don't tell me I bought somebody's family heirloom by accident." Eddie's face told me the answer before he spoke, but his words sealed it. Richard Blackwood was Karen's father, Eddie confirmed, his voice taking on the tone people use when they're about to deliver news that's going to complicate your life exponentially. Lost the RV in 2019 to owe some business debts that got out of hand. From what I heard through the grapevine, he'd invested heavily in some tech startup that promised to revolutionize something or other. When it went belly up, he had to sell off assets to keep from losing his house. The RV went to Cascade Federal Credit Union as part of a debt settlement package. This information should have made me feel better about my legal right to own the vehicle, but instead, it made him feel like I'd unknowingly kicked a grieving family when they were already down. Eddie continued. Here's where it gets interesting, though. According to the documentation I saw, that RV was actually sold twice in the bank's records. Once in a private sale that didn't go through for some reason, and then again at the public auction where you bought it. Something about the paperwork wasn't quite right, but the bank processed both transactions anyway. Before I could fully process this revelation, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Mr. Thompson, this is Grace O'Connor, former HOA secretary. We need to talk about Karen Blackwood and your RV situation. Coffee at Sunrise Diner on Main Street, 2 p.m. today. If you're interested in knowing what you're really dealing with, issued the message to Eddie, who just shook his head and muttered something about small towns and their endless capacity for manufacturing drama. Out of thin air, Grace O'Connor turned out to be a 35-year-old woman with the kind of tired eyes that suggested she'd seen too much of humanity's capacity for petty vindictiveness. She slid into the diner booth across from me with a manila folder, thick enough to choke a horse and the expression of someone about to spill. Secrets that had been weighing on her conscience for too long. Karen Blackwood is preparing for war, she said without preamble, sliding a business card across the table. She's retained Benjamin Crawford, the HOA's legal counsel, and they're building a case to prove you obtained that RV through fraudulent means. The business card belonged to Crawford and Associates, a law firm that specialized in property disputes and civil litigation, Grace continued. Karen's convinced that you somehow manipulated the bank auction or forged documentation to steal what she considers her family's rightful property. She's been gathering evidence for weeks, including hiring a private investigator to research your background and financial history. This was escalating beyond neighborhood dispute territory and heading straight into legal nightmare land, complete with expensive lawyers and the kind of courtroom drama that could drain my retirement savings faster than a casino addiction. There's more, Grace said, opening her folder to reveal photographs, legal documents, and what looked suspiciously like surveillance reports. Karen has also contacted the State Vehicle Inspection Office, claiming your RV has suspicious documentation and possibly altered identification numbers. She's hoping to get it impounded pending an investigation, which would effectively take it away from you while the legal process drags on for months or possibly years. The methodical nature of Karen's campaign was both impressive and terrifying, suggesting a level of determination that went far beyond normal neighborly concern. My phone buzzed again, this time with a message from Tom Weaver, the neighbor who lived 2 houses down from Karen. Dude, Karen's been asking everyone on the street about you and that RV. She came to my house at 3 a.m. last night asking if I'd seen any suspicious vehicle theft activity in the neighborhood. I think she might be having some kind of breakdown. Watch yourself. I showed this message to Grace, who nodded grimly and closed her folder with the finality of someone delivering a terminal diagnosis. Marcus, I don't think this is just about the RV, Grace said as we prepared to leave the diner. I think there's something deeper going on with Karen's mental state since her father died. The way she talks about that vehicle, it's like she believes it contains some piece of him that she can't bear to lose. But what worries me is how far she's willing to go to get it back. As I drove home in my suddenly controversial Airstream, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was about to become the central figure in a drama I never auditioned for, starring opposite a grieving daughter who decided I was the villain in her story of loss and recovery. Sunday morning at 6:30 a.m. arrived with the subtle grace of a fire alarm in a library. The sound that jolted me from sleep wasn't my usual coffee, maker timer, but the unmistakable wail of police sirens getting progressively louder as they approached my street. I stumbled to the RV's front window, still wearing yesterday's clothes because I'd fallen asleep researching property law until nearly 3 in the morning, and discovered what could only be described as a neighborhood circus in full swing. Karen Blackwood stood in the middle of the street like a conductor orchestrating a symphony of chaos, flanked by a man in an expensive suit, who could only be the infamous Benjamin Crawford, and surrounded by at least a dozen neighbors who looked like they'd been summoned from their Sunday morning routines by the promise of premium small-town drama. "There he is," Karen's voice cut through the morning air with the precision of a prosecution attorney addressing a jury. "That's the man who stole my family's RV, officers. I have all the documentation right here to prove that the vehicle belongs to me." She brandished a thick manila folder above her head like some kind of legal battle flag, and I could see even from my window that she'd come prepared for war. The folder looked professionally organized with colored tabs and what appeared to be laminated photographs. The kind of evidence presentation that suggested weeks of careful preparation rather than a spontaneous neighborly complaint. Two police officers emerged from their patrol car with the weary expressions of public servants who'd clearly dealt with HOA disputes before and knew exactly how their Sunday morning was about to be consumed. Officer Janet Walker, according to the name tag I could just make out, looked like she had the kind of experience that came from years of mediating civil disputes between people who had too much time and too little perspective. Her younger partner, Officer Mike Johnson, seemed eager to please and slightly overwhelmed by the crowd that had gathered to witness whatever Karen had orchestrated for their entertainment. Benjamin Crawford stepped forward with the smooth confidence of a man accustomed to being the most educated person in any room, extending his hand to the officers with practiced professional charm. "Officers, I'm Benjamin Crawford, legal counsel for the Willowbrook HOA. My client has substantial evidence that the RV in question was obtained through fraudulent means, and we're requesting immediate impoundment pending a full investigation." The way he spoke with careful emphasis on legal terminology made it clear that this wasn't Karen's first rodeo when it came to weaponizing the legal system against perceived enemies. I watched this performance for about 30 seconds before making a decision that would either prove my innocence or confirm everyone's suspicions about my sanity. Instead of staying inside and letting the lawyers handle everything like a reasonable person might do, I opened my RV door and stepped outside to address the growing crowd directly. "Officers," I called out, my voice carrying the kind of calm that comes from either complete confidence or complete resignation. "I'd like to come to the station to discuss this matter officially, and I'll be driving this RV there myself to demonstrate my legal right to operate it." The reaction to my announcement was immediate and electric. Officer Johnson looked confused, clearly wondering why someone who'd allegedly stolen a vehicle would volunteer to drive it to the police station. Several neighbors began whispering among themselves, and I caught fragments of conversations that ranged from supportive to suspicious. Helen Walsh, the 72-year-old neighborhood historian who'd lived on this street since the Carter administration, stepped forward from the crowd with the authority of someone who'd witnessed decades of local drama. "Officers, I remember this RV from 30 years ago. Richard Blackwood used to wash it in his driveway every Sunday morning just like clockwork." Benjamin Crawford immediately seized on this testimony, pulling out a legal pad and scribbling notes with the enthusiasm of a prosecutor who'd just been handed a smoking gun. "Mrs. Walsh's testimony supports our position that this vehicle has deep historical ties to the Blackwood family and this specific neighborhood. The question isn't whether Mr. Thompson currently possesses documentation, but whether that documentation represents legitimate ownership or sophisticated fraud." His words carried the kind of weight that comes from years of turning civil disputes into billable hours. Karen's face during this exchange was a masterclass in barely controlled emotion. I could see her cycling through rage, vindication, and something that looked almost like grief, as if the mere presence of the RV in her neighborhood had reopened wounds that hadn't properly healed. "This isn't just about property law," she said, her voice cracking slightly. "This vehicle contains 30 years of my family's memories. My father taught me to drive this RV when I was 16. We took family vacations across the country in it. It's not just transportation, it's our heritage." The emotional appeal was effective. I had to admit even I felt a twinge of guilt listening to her describe the personal significance of what I'd always thought of as simply a well-restored vintage vehicle. But emotions, no matter how genuine, don't trump legal documentation. And I had every piece of paperwork necessary to prove my ownership. "Officers," I said, pulling Mikey's from my pocket with deliberate confidence. "I'll see you at the station. I assume you'll want to verify all documentation there rather than conducting official business in the middle of a residential street." As he climbed into the driver's seat of my Airstream, I caught sight of Benjamin Crawford whispering urgently into Karen's ear, probably strategizing their next move for when we reached the police station. The crowd began to disperse, but several neighbors pulled out their phones to record my departure, apparently sensing that this moment would make for premium social media content. One teenager even shouted, "Floored man drives stolen RV to police station," loud enough for everyone to hear, which got a laugh from the crowd and made me wonder if my confidence was about to become internet famous for all the wrong reasons. The drive to the station took exactly 12 minutes, during which time I had the surreal experience of being followed by a police escort, a Mercedes SUV full of angry HOA members, and at least 3 neighbor cars whose occupants apparently had nothing better to do on a Sunday morning than witness whatever was about to unfold at the Willowbrook Police Department. The Willowbrook Police Department on a Sunday morning typically handled noise complaints, drunk and disorderly cases, and the occasional domestic dispute that couldn't wait until Monday. What they weren't prepared for was the legal circus that rolled up to their front door in the form of 1 vintage Airstream, 2 patrol cars, a Mercedes SUV, and enough documentation to start a small law firm. Sergeant Patricia Williams, a former military police officer whose non-nonsense demeanor suggested she'd seen enough human drama to last several lifetimes, emerged from the building with the expression of someone who'd just realized her quiet Sunday shift was about to become significantly more complicated than anticipated. Karen and Benjamin Crawford had clearly spent the drive to the station strategizing because they approached Sergeant Williams with a coordinated precision of a legal tag team. Crawford carried a leather briefcase that looked expensive enough to have its own insurance policy, while Karen clutched her manila folder like it contained the secrets of the universe. "Sergeant Williams, I'm Benjamin Crawford, representing Mrs. Blackwood in a clear case of vehicle theft and document fraud," he began, his voice carrying the kind of authority that comes from years of intimidating people with legal terminology. "We have comprehensive evidence that Mr. Thompson has obtained this RV through illegal means, and we're requesting immediate impoundment, pending a full investigation." The comprehensive evidence turned out to be impressive in both volume and presentation quality. Crawford spread across Sergeant Williams' desk a collection of photographs showing the Blackwood family with the RV, dating back to the 1992 and original registration documents from 1975, maintenance records written in Richard Blackwood's own handwriting, and even home videos transferred to DVD that showed Karen as a teenager learning to drive the vehicle. The presentation had clearly been prepared by someone who understood that visual evidence carries more weight than verbal testimony, especially when dealing with overworked police officers who wanted to resolve disputes as quickly as possible. But Crawford's master stroke was the temporary injunction order he produced with a magician's flourish, a legal document that would effectively freeze my use of the RV until ownership could be definitively established through the courts. This injunction was prepared based on substantial evidence of fraudulent acquisition, he explained to Sergeant Williams, his tone suggesting that signing it would be a mere formality. "Mrs. Blackwood has demonstrated clear prior ownership, and Mr. Thompson's sudden appearance with this specific vehicle raises obvious questions about legitimacy." The document looked official enough to convince most people, complete with legal seals and enough whereas clauses to choke a courthouse. I let them present their entire case without interruption, watching Sergeant Williams' expression carefully as she reviewed their evidence. She was clearly impressed by the thoroughness of their presentation, and I could see her beginning to lean toward the path of least resistance, which would involve impounding my RV and letting the courts sort out the mess over the following months. When Crawford finished his presentation and looked at me expectantly, obviously confident that I was about to crumble under the weight of their legal pressure, I decided it was time to play my ace. Sergeant Williams, before you sign any injunction. Orders. I have one simple request, I said, my voice carrying the kind of calm that comes from either complete confidence or complete insanity. I'd like you to have your vehicle inspection specialist examine the VIN that's stamped into the frame of this RV. Specifically, the number that's etched into the metal beneath the chassis near the left rear axle assembly. And I'd like you to cross-reference that VIN with one document, the official bank auction record from Cascade Federal Credit Union, dated the 15th of March, 2019. The effect of my request was immediate and dramatic. Crawford's confident expression faltered slightly, and I saw him exchange a glance with Karen that suggested this wasn't part of their prepared strategy. Sergeant Williams called for Dave Morrison, the department's vehicle inspection specialist, a 51-year-old former mechanic who approached disputes about automotive documentation with the methodical thoroughness of a forensic scientist. The atmosphere in the room shifted from catch the thief to investigate the mystery, and I could see the mental gears turning as everyone realized this case was more complex than a simple theft claim. While we waited for Morrison to gather his equipment and begin his inspection, Karen filled the silence with increasingly emotional testimony about her childhood memories of the RV. She described family road trips to national parks, camping adventures where her father taught her to fish, and quiet evenings spent reading books by lantern light while rain drummed against the aluminum roof. Her stories were vivid and specific, filled with the kind of details that suggested genuine memories rather than fabricated testimony. She could describe the exact location of cabinet latches, the way the fold-out table mechanism worked, and even the specific sound the door made when it closed properly. The emotional weight of her testimony was affecting everyone in the room, including me. Here was a woman who clearly had deep, meaningful connections to this vehicle, describing experiences that had shaped her childhood and her relationship with her deceased father. I began to feel like maybe I was the villain in this story after all. The outsider who'd unknowingly purchased someone else's treasured family memories and was now hiding behind legal technicalities to keep them. The guilt was starting to gnaw at my conscience in ways that made me question whether owning the RV was worth the emotional damage it was clearly causing. Morrison's inspection took nearly an hour, during which time he photographed, measured, and documented every identifying mark on the vehicle's frame and chassis. He cross-referenced serial numbers, checked for signs of tampering or alteration, and verified manufacturing codes against official Airstream company records. When he finally emerged from beneath the RV, his clipboard covered with notes and measurements. The room fell silent in anticipation of his findings. The VIN matches perfectly with the Cascade Federal Auction documentation, he announced, his tone suggesting professional certainty. This vehicle was legally sold at public auction on the 15th of March, 2019 to Mr. Thompson, and all documentation appears authentic and unaltered. The silence that followed Morrison's announcement was deafening. Crawford's injunction order suddenly looked like expensive paper, and Karen's face went through a series of emotions that ranged from disbelief to devastation. But instead of accepting defeat, she did something that caught everyone off guard. "That's impossible!" she shouted, her voice cracking with desperation. "The VIN can be faked. He must have bought this from whoever stole it from my family years ago. There has to be some kind of conspiracy." Her reaction transformed the room from a place of legal resolution into something that resembled a family therapy session gone horribly wrong. The drive back to Willowbrook from the police station felt like returning from a battlefield where nobody had actually won. Karen's Mercedes followed behind my Airstream at a respectful distance, but I could see her in my rear-view mirror, gripping her steering wheel with the intensity of someone whose entire worldview had just been challenged by inconvenient facts. Instead of heading straight home like any reasonable person would after such an emotionally exhausting morning, he made a decision that probably qualified as either very brave or very stupid. I pulled into my driveway, stepped out of the RV, and walked directly to Karen's car as she parked across the street. "Mrs. Blackwood," I called out through her partially open window. "Would you like to come inside and talk? I think we need to have..." A conversation about this RV that doesn't involve lawyers or police officers. The invitation surprised both of us. I think here was a woman who'd spent the last week treating me like a criminal, and I was voluntarily opening my home to her, but something about her reaction at the police station, the way she'd cycled through disbelief and desperation, when confronted with evidence that contradicted her version of reality, made me think there was more to this story than simple property disputes. Karen hesitated for a long moment, clearly weighing the wisdom of entering what she probably considered enemy territory. Finally, she nodded and followed me up the steps into the RV, moving with the careful precision of someone entering a space that held both painful memories and current legal complications. The moment she stepped inside, her entire demeanor changed. She stood in the center of the living area, slowly turning to take in every detail, her eyes moving across surfaces and fixtures with the familiarity of someone revisiting a childhood home after decades away. "The cedar paneling is still here," she whispered, running her fingers along the wood grain that Eddie Miller had carefully restored to its original luster. "Dad installed this himself when I was 12. He said it would make the RV feel more like home and less like camping." She moved toward the small kitchen area, opening and closing cabinet doors with the automatic knowledge of someone who'd performed these actions thousands of times before. "This cabinet always stuck," she murmured, demonstrating the exact twist and pull motion needed to open a particular door that had indeed given me trouble since I'd owned the vehicle. I watched her navigate the space with increasing discomfort, realizing that her memories of this RV weren't fabricated delusions, but genuine experiences from a life lived within these aluminum walls. The guilt that had started gnawing at me during her testimony at the police station now threatened to consume me entirely. Here was tangible proof that this wasn't just a vehicle to her. It was a repository of family history. And I was the interloper who'd accidentally purchased someone else's childhood. "Karen," I said gently, settling into the dinette booth that converted into my bed each night. "I need to tell you something that's going to be difficult to hear, but I think you deserve to know the truth." I'd spent the previous evening doing research that went far beyond simple property records, digging into bankruptcy filings, business registrations, and newspaper archives that painted a picture of Richard Blackwood's final years that was both tragic and complicated. "Your father didn't lose this RV to the bank in 2019. He sold it privately in 2018, a full year before the official bankruptcy proceedings began." The color drained from Karen's face as I continued. Richard had invested heavily in a tech startup called Innovate Tech Solutions that promised to revolutionize small business inventory management. When the company collapsed in early 2018, he was left with significant personal debts. Because he'd used his house and other assets as collateral for the investment, he sold the RV quietly to raise cash for debt payments, probably hoping to resolve his financial problems before anyone in the family found out about the extent of his losses. I pulled out copies of documents I'd obtained from the county clerk's office, showing the chain of ownership that traced the RV from Richard's private sale through 2 subsequent owners before it ended up at the Cascade Federal Auction, where I'd purchased it. "The reason you never knew about the sale is that your father specifically requested that the transaction be kept confidential. According to the paperwork, he was planning to buy it back once his financial situation improved." Karen sat down heavily in the booth across from me, her hands shaking as she processed information that contradicted everything she'd believed about her father's final years. "But I have clear memories of this RV being in our driveway until he died," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I remember visiting him and seeing it parked outside his house. I remember him talking about future camping trips we'd take together." The confusion in her voice was heartbreaking. The sound of someone discovering that their most treasured memories might not align with documented reality. This is where I had to deliver the most difficult part of the truth. Information I'd learned from a phone conversation with my friend, Dr. Sarah Miller, a psychologist who specialized in grief counseling and memory disorders. "Karen, What you're experiencing is something called confabulation. It's not lying or intentional deception. It's your mind's way of protecting you from a loss that was too painful to fully accept. When someone we love dies, especially when there are unresolved issues or secrets, our brains sometimes create alternative memories that feel more emotionally satisfying than the real ones. I could see her struggling with this explanation. Her rational mind wearing against emotional attachments that had sustained her through years of grief. Your memories of time spent in this RV with your father are absolutely real, I continued, trying to soften the blow. But some of them might be composite memories combining experiences from different time periods or mixing real events with hopes and dreams about things you wished had happened. When you saw me driving this particular RV through your neighborhood, it triggered those memories, and your mind interpreted my presence as theft rather than legal ownership. The silence that followed stretched for several minutes, during which Karen seemed to age before my ayahs. She looked around the RV with new understanding, seeing it not as stolen property, but as a place where her memories and reality had become entangled in ways that made emotional sense, even when they didn't make factual sense. "I need to ask you something," she finally said, her voice steadier than it had been all morning. "When you bought this RV, was there anything personal left inside? Any family items or mementos?" I had to be honest about this part, too. The auction listing specified that the vehicle was being sold with all contents included, but when I picked it up, it was empty, except for the basic furnishings and appliances. If there were personal items, they were removed before the auction. I could see her processing this information, probably wondering what had happened to family photographs, camping equipment, or other mementos that should have been part of the RV's contents. "There was always a small wooden box," she said, more to herself than to me. "Dad kept it under the driver's seat. It had old maps, camping permits from our trips, and some letters I wrote to him when I was in college. If you ever find anything like that, would you please let me know?" The request was so reasonable and heartfelt that I immediately agreed, though I suspected that the wooden box and its contents had been lost to time and circumstances years before I'd ever entered the picture. As Karen prepared to leave, she paused at the RV door and turned back to look at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Marcus, I owe you an apology for everything this week." I let my grief turn into anger, and I directed that anger at you when you were just an innocent person who bought something at a legal auction. But I need you to understand that this isn't really over. There's something about this situation that still doesn't feel right, and I can't shake the feeling that there are pieces of this puzzle we haven't found yet. 3 days after our conversation, in the RV, I thought the Karen situation had finally reached some kind of peaceful resolution. I was wrong in ways that would have been hilarious if they weren't so legally terrifying. Wednesday evening arrived with the subtle drama of a neighborhood emergency broadcast delivered in the form of official-looking notices stuffed into every mailbox on Maple Street. Emergency hoeing. The flyers announced in bold lettering that suggested apocalyptic urgency. Community safety concern regarding fraudulent property claims. All residents are required to attend. Wednesday, 7:00 p.m., Community Center. The Willowbrook Community Center hadn't seen this much excitement since the great mailbox color controversy of 2019, when half the neighborhood had nearly come to blows over whether desert sand and warm beige were sufficiently different shades to violate the HOA's color uniformity standards. Tonight, however, the folding chairs were arranged like a courtroom with Karen and Benjamin Crawford seated at a table facing the audience like prosecutors preparing to deliver closing arguments in a capital case. The turnout was impressive. Nearly 40 neighbors who'd apparently decided that watching their HOA president attempt to publicly destroy a newcomer was better entertainment than whatever Netflix had to offer. Karen had clearly spent the 3 days since our conversation preparing for this moment with the methodical intensity of a general planning a decisive battle. She'd transformed from the emotionally distraught woman who'd sat in my RV processing painful truths about her father into something resembling a courtroom attorney with a personal vendetta. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice carrying across the room with practiced authority. "We are here tonight because our community's safety and integrity have been threatened by someone who has used sophisticated deception to infiltrate our neighborhood." Benjamin Crawford rose from his seat with a leather portfolio that looked like it cost more than most people's monthly rent, spreading documents across the table with the theatrical flair of someone accustomed to commanding attention through legal intimidation. "Mrs. Blackwood has prepared a comprehensive case proving that Mr. Thompson cannot possibly have legitimate ownership of the vehicle in question." He announced his tone, suggesting that my guilt was already a foregone conclusion. "We will demonstrate that only someone with intimate knowledge of this RV's history could answer certain specific questions about its unique characteristics and modifications." This was the moment I realized that Karen had set an elaborate trap, one that would either vindicate her completely or destroy her credibility forever, depending on how I chose to respond. She was gambling everything on the assumption that I couldn't possibly know details about the RV that only a long-term owner would know, and she was planning to use my ignorance as proof that I'd obtained the vehicle through fraudulent means. The legal brilliance of the strategy was almost admirable. "If you could ignore the fact that it was completely insane, I'll accept your challenge," I said, standing up from my seat in the back of the room. "But I'd like to ask you a specific question. First, Mrs. Blackwood." The room fell silent with the anticipation of an audience watching a high-stakes poker game reach its climax. "In all the stories you've told about this RV, you've consistently mentioned a distinctive deep scratch on the rear chrome bumper caused by your father accidentally backing into a lamppost during a camping trip to Yellowstone National Park in 1987, Can. You described that scratch in detail for everyone here?" Karen's face lit up with the confidence of someone who'd been handed the perfect opportunity to demonstrate her superior knowledge. She stood and addressed the room like a professor, delivering a lecture on a subject she'd spent years mastering. The scratch was about 6 in long and maybe a 4 in deep, running diagonally across the chrome surface, about 8 in from the left edge of the bumper. It had started to rust slightly around the edges because Dad never got around to having it properly repaired, and you could see where the underlying metal had been exposed to the elements for years. She continued with increasing enthusiasm, describing not just the scratch itself, but the circumstances that had created it, the camping trip where it had happened, and even her father's reaction when he discovered the damage the next morning. Her description was so vivid and detailed that several neighbors nodded sympathetically, clearly impressed by the depth of her knowledge about this specific aspect of the RV's history. When she finished, she looked at me with the triumphant expression of someone who'd just delivered checkmate in a chess game. I let the silence stretch for a few heartbeats, allowing her moment of victory to settle into the room before I responded. Then, without saying a word, I walked outside to where my Airstream was parked in the community center lot, retrieved a clean cloth from the driver's seat, and returned to the meeting room. The entire audience followed me outside, forming a semicircle, around the rear of the RV like spectators at some kind of automotive seance, everyone straining to get the best view of whatever revelation was about to unfold. Working slowly and deliberately, I cleaned away the thin layer of road dust that had accumulated on the chrome bumper during the week's driving, polishing the surface until it gleamed under the community sense parking lot lights. What emerged? From beneath that layer of dust was a chrome bumper in absolutely pristine condition, without so much as a minor ding or scratch anywhere on its surface. The silence that followed was so complete that I could hear someone's phone buzzing from inside the community center 30 FT away. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said, reaching into my jacket pocket and pulling out a manila envelope I'd been carrying since the previous day. "I'd like to show you something I obtained from the Airstream Company's historical archives in Ohio." I withdrew a yellowed photograph that had clearly been professionally preserved, holding it up so the crowd could see both the image and the official Airstream Company letterhead at the bottom. "This is the original factory publicity photograph of this exact RV, taken when it rolled off the production line in Jackson Center, Ohio, in March of 1975. The photograph showed my Airstream in absolutely pristine condition, parked in front of the Airstream factory with a small placard displaying its serial number and production date. More importantly, it showed the rear chrome bumper in the same condition it was in today, completely unmarked and gleaming like it had just been polished. The implications of this evidence hit the crowd like a physical blow, and I could see the realization spreading across faces as people understood what they were witnessing. "Karen," I said gently, my voice carrying across the parking lot with the authority of someone presenting irrefutable evidence. "I believe you have genuine memories of a scratch on a chrome bumper, but those memories are from your father's original RV, not this one. This particular vehicle has never had that scratch because it's never been to Yellowstone National Park or any of the other places you remember visiting with your family." Before anyone could fully process this revelation, Eddie Miller appeared. From the edge of the parking lot, carrying an old cassette player and wearing the expression of someone who'd been wrestling with his conscience for days. "I've got something else you all need to hear," he announced, his voice heavy with the weight of secrets that had been eating at him since our last conversation. He set the cassette player down on a nearby picnic table and pressed play. And Richard Blackwood's voice emerged from the small speakers with the clarity of someone speaking from beyond the grave. "Eddie, I'm bringing the RV by tomorrow for what's probably going to be the last time," Richard's recorded voice said, the pain evident even through the tiny audio quality of the old recording. "I've got to sell it to pay down some debts, and I just want to make sure everything's in good condition for whoever buys it next. I hope they'll take better care of it than I have. Don't say anything to Karen about this, okay? She'd never forgive me if she knew I was selling the last piece of our camping days together. I've already disappointed her enough." The silence that followed the end of the recording was devastating, more complete than any courtroom dramatic pause could ever be. It stripped away Karen's last argument, her final justification that she was protecting her father's legacy rather than pursuing a delusion. The evidence was now overwhelming and undeniable. I owned the RV legally. Karen's memories were of a different vehicle entirely, and her father had deliberately hidden the sale from her to spare her additional pain during his final difficult years. 3 weeks passed after the community center confrontation, during which Karen Blackwood seemed to vanish from the neighborhood like morning mist, disappearing under Florida sunshine. Her perfectly maintained lawn began showing signs of neglect. Her Mercedes remained parked in the same spot for days at a time, and the usual stream of HOA violation notices that had been the bane of every resident's existence suddenly stopped appearing in mailboxes. I should have felt victorious. Should have been enjoying my peaceful lakeside mornings without the constant tension of legal threats and neighborhood surveillance. But instead, I found myself consumed by an idea that was either brilliantly compassionate or completely insane. The idea had started during a conversation with Eddie Miller, who'd been carrying his own burden of guilt about the cassette recording and the secrets he'd kept about Richard Blackwood's final years. "You know, Marcus," he'd said while we shared coffee at his workshop, "there's something that's been eating at me since that night at the community center. Karen wasn't completely wrong about her memories. There really was another RV, the one her father actually owned for most of her childhood, and it really did have that scratch she described so perfectly." This revelation had sent me on a 3-week treasure hunt through salvage yards and RV graveyards across central Florida. Following a paper trail that led through multiple owners and eventually to a fate that most vintage vehicles eventually meet, I found Richard Blackwood's original RV in a salvage yard outside Ocala, Florida, sitting among dozens of other recreational vehicles that had reached the end of their useful lives. The contrast between this deteriorating hulk and my pristinely restored Airstream was stark and heartbreaking. This RV looked exactly like what it was, a family's beloved vacation home that had been abandoned to the elements after its owner could no longer afford to maintain it. The chrome bumper that Karen had described in such perfect detail was there, complete with the diagonal scratch and rust stains that had been etched into her memory during countless childhood camping trips. More importantly, wedged beneath the driver's seat exactly where Karen had said it would be, I found a small wooden box that had somehow survived years of neglect and weather exposure. Inside were treasures that no amount of money could have purchased. Handwritten letters from a young Karen to her father during her college years, camping permits and maps from family vacations spanning 2 decades, and dozens of Polaroid photographs showing a happy family enjoying the kind of simple pleasures that create lifelong memories. These weren't just family mementos. They were the physical evidence of the childhood Karen remembered. Proof that her memories weren't entirely constructed from grief and wishful thinking. The logistics of what I did next would have challenged a professional moving company, but I was determined to execute my plan with the kind of precision that would make the gesture impossible to misinterpret or refuse. On a Sunday morning, exactly 1 month after the community center meeting, I arranged for the salvaged RV to be towed to Karen's house and positioned in her driveway, exactly where her father's original vehicle had always been parked. The contrast between the deteriorating RV and the manicured suburban landscape was jarring, but it was also somehow perfect in its symbolism. I left the wooden box on her front porch along with a manila envelope containing the title transfer paperwork that legally transferred ownership of the salvaged RV to Karen and a simple handwritten note that said, "Real heritage comes home. The memories in the wooden box are yours, no strings attached." Marcus, I'd wrestled with the wording of that note for days, trying to strike the right balance between kindness and finality, between offering peace and making it clear that this gesture closed the book on our conflict permanently. The psychological impact of my gift was immediate and devastating in ways that I'd hoped for, but hadn't fully anticipated. Karen couldn't respond with anger because I'd given her something rather than taken something away. She couldn't refuse the gift because it contained genuine family artifacts that belonged to her by any reasonable moral standard. She couldn't continue playing the victim because I demonstrated a level of generosity that transformed our entire conflict from a property dispute into something that resembled an act of unexpected kindness from someone she'd spent weeks treating as an enemy. Within a week, Karen had quietly submitted her resignation as HOA president through a brief email that simply stated, "Effective immediately, personal reasons. Thank you for your understanding." No explanation, no farewell speech, no attempt to maintain her authority or influence over the community that had witnessed her public breakdown. The woman who'd wielded HOA regulations like weapons of social control had essentially disappeared from public life, leaving behind only the gradually improving condition of the salvaged RV in her driveway as evidence of her new focus. The unexpected epilogue to this story came in the form of a phone call from Jennifer Blackwood, Karen's 32-year-old daughter, who'd flown in from Seattle after hearing about her mother's situation through concerned neighbors. "Mr. Thompson, I wanted to thank you for what you did for my mom," Jennifer said, her voice carrying the exhaustion of someone who'd been dealing with family crisis management for several weeks. "She's been working on restoring Dad's old RV, and it's like she's finally healthily processing his death instead of creating fantasies about stolen property and legal conspiracies." But the real conclusion to our neighborhood drama arrived exactly 1 month later in the form of an official letter from Cascade Federal Credit Union that made my morning coffee taste like liquid anxiety. The letter, written in the careful legal language that banks use when they're about to complicate someone's life, informed me that there had been irregularities discovered in the 2019 auction documentation and that someone had filed a formal challenge to the legitimacy of my purchase. The truly unsettling part was the final paragraph, which mentioned that the challenge hadn't come from Karen Blackwood or anyone in her family, but from a third party claiming prior ownership rights based on documentation predating the auction. You know what? Marcus taught me something I never expected to learn at 52. Sometimes the things we think we've lost forever find their way back to use in the most unexpected forms. I spent weeks fighting for what I thought was mine, only to discover that letting opened the door to something even more precious. That wooden box with my childhood letters, it healed wounds I didn't even know were still bleeding. If stories like ours remind you that life's plot twists often lead to better endings than we originally planned, maybe give Happer Stories a like and subscribe. Trust me, you'll want to hear what happens when that mysterious third party shows up. Claiming Marcus's RV. Some neighborhood dramas are just getting started.